Hey, this is James Hudson for RunItOnce.com, and this is part 2 of my 4-tabling Zoom series with a variety of different stakes here. And I think this is roughly where we left off last time. So just one quick comment. The hand on the top right with the King 10 suited, I think I ended up missing the opener's stack size. Here, it's I think it's okay to flat here, but I'm going to have less options and basically have to play more fit or fold versus that kind of stack size. So basically, if I flopped a king or a queen, I'm probably just, a king or a 10, I'm probably just going broke or any kind of flush draw or anything like that. But this is a kind of flop where if we were deeper, I could probably float, given that I have king high, which is good some percentage of the time, the backdoor hearts, and then a couple of backdoor straight draws. And I'm not always going to get barreled on this board because it doesn't look like I should have a ton of stuff that's calling once and then folding the turn. Especially given that villain should expect me to be 3-betting stuff like 10s, jacks, queens, kings. So when I do float this board, I think my range is going to be overwhelmingly ace-x or better heavy, pretty much. So I should be able to throw some floats in there and not be able to be blown off my hand too much. And also, I shouldn't be perceived to be having a ton of kind of 8x type hands in my flatting range versus a cutoff open. So let's continue rolling the footage. Bottom left, 2-4 offsuit. It's a min raise, which makes it potentially playable, just because we have position and we had deepish stacks, I think, there. So that's a situation where I probably could have peeled and basically just hoped to kind of hit a hand, and if I do, hope to get paid off given that we're relatively deep. Top right, I end up peeling because the bet's so small, and I have king high, and like I said, I had those backdoor draws. I think it's okay, but definitely not thrilled here. I'm expecting villain to be putting in a lot of small, kind of annoying bets, which is going to make my life kind of difficult with king high. Picking up second pair definitely helps because now even if I'm running into ace-x, I've got some outs, unless I run into top set or something like that. But yeah, if he bets $1 or $2 again, I would assume I'll probably call and then fold the river. He checks back, and now I think I should probably just value bet. But I don't think he's really got too much at this point, and if he does have a hand that's calling, I think it's decently likely that he's got, something like jacks, queens, kings. I mean, that's not a huge chunk of his range, but that's going to be a decent chunk of his calling range. And obviously we beat all the 10x, but if we bet too big, he's likely going to be able to get away from those. So I'm just going to make a small bet, and hopefully he just makes a crying call with any pair. Bottom right's a pretty standard defend for me. I think it should be a call for most people. And like I said, top right, he ends up having queens, so we end up saving some money, I would assume, by betting that small. Although it's possible that if we check to him, that he doesn't even value bet that. But, I mean, that's hard to know with 3 hands on a guy. Bottom right, I think I hit that flop often enough that I don't really need to be peeling with ace either. If it was something more disconnected, where it's less likely that I hit a pair, basically, like something like 2-4-4 rainbow, I think I'd be better off peeling with the ace high, but on that kind of board I'm going to have enough straight draws and one pair hands and stuff like that that I can continue with, so I don't think I need to peel ace high probably. Pick up aces in the top right, that's always fun. Bottom left is, so king queen suited is a hand that I can go either way on, blind versus blind. The more often you expect them to peel to 3-bets, the better it is to 3-bet, obviously. But if you're playing against guys that you really feel are kind of on the tighter side, and when you get 4-bet, you're just kind of screwed, then you're probably better off just flatting because the hand has such good playability. And obviously, you don't want to get blown off the hand if you're expecting someone to play more or less 4-bet or fold out of position. So if they're doing that, then you'd rather flat, whereas if you expect them to be on the fishier side, where they're calling a lot of 3-bets, or just someone who's playing loosely in general, then the hand's going to do fine to 3-bet. And versus those looser players, if they're kind of like a loose aggressive opponent, and this is going to apply more probably at higher stakes, but I don't know if this trend has caught on a little bit more at lower stakes, and there's a lot of 4-betting going on in this blind versus blind situation, then your hand's going to play really well versus a wide 4-bet, 4-betting range, whether or not it's wide for value or has a bunch of bluffs in it. So yeah, get flatted in the top right. Not exactly a dream flop. I mean, we don't have the ace of clubs, and there's a lot of bad turns and rivers. Basically, like a lot of bad runouts. But I'm going to start by betting and going from there. I'm probably just going to go bet, bet, bet unless we get a really bad river, and basically just hope for the best. It's one of those spots where you're normally better off just betting until you get told that they have a better hand. The only problem is that given his stack size, I'm going to be in a pretty tough spot if he jams here, and I've got a feeling he is going to jam. So he thinks for a while, and then jams on us, and unfortunately we have one hand on him, but we know he's playing a shorter stack. I would expect him to be min-raising or making a slightly bigger raise if he had a hand like a 2-pair or a flop set on the flop. So when he raises here, I guess he's representing basically pocket tens, queen 10, and then jack 9. The problem I'm getting now is though that I'm getting almost 3-1. So I think readless I should just be calling here, but I'm certainly not kind of really excited about the spot. It's also possible that he has a hand like 9-10 of clubs or 10 jack of clubs or something that picked up equity and is just going to go and try and push that equity. Although I think versus unknown weaker players or perceived weaker players, they're more likely to take passive lines with those kind of hands and just keep on calling. But I mean, like I said, I'm getting a pretty good price at this point, and hopefully I run into like bottom 2 or you know, a combo draw and not something that I'm drawing stone dead to. He obviously ends up hitting with jack 9 though, and I'm drawing dead. Unfortunate, but it's kind of a tough spot to get away from my hand given how drawy the board is and the fact that he's an unknown and the fact that he doesn't have a full stack. That being said though, if he did have a full stack, I think it's a pretty easy bet fold, just because even when he is semi-bluffing, he's going to have tons of outs, and I just can't. It's tough for me to be able to fade those outs and then guess correctly on rivers, as well as the fact that when I'm behind his value range, I'm way, way behind his value range, because a lot of times it's just sets and straights. Basically, I think I can get away from it if he has more money. A bunch of hands here. Gonna squeeze with the jacks, be squeezing in the spot versus pretty much any players, I think. I 3-bet bottom left with ace-2 of diamonds. This is basically, I mean, it's a bluff, but it plays okay when I'm called a lot of the time with the flush draw and then the wheel draw, or you know, that I get the fact that I can flop a wheel draw anyway. Once I get this flop, I could c-bet and just try and get one bet out of his 9s, 10s, jacks type hands. But given that I'm at the absolute bottom of my ace-x range here, I kind of choose to play it a little bit more passively, and I'm looking to bluff catch a couple of streets here. And I mean, in part because I don't feel comfortable bet calling here. Not that I expect to get bluff raised a ton, but it feels kind of dirty to just bet fold the flop. And I also give him the opportunity to basically just stab with some hands that are never going to put any money in the pot if I bet myself. So stuff like maybe like queen jack or like pocket 2s through 6s, hands like that. So I think that plays okay. Obviously it's important if you're playing against better players, or more aggressive players I should say, that this range is somewhat balanced and that you're check calling here with, you know, pocket 8s or aces, or a hand like ace queen of hearts or something. Like something that there needs to be hands in your range here that can take a little bit more heat than ace-2, because I'm not just going to wildly check call down with ace-2 here and feel good about it, because he's able to value bet all hands that are better than mine, basically. I mean, not all. He's not going to 3-bet. Sorry, he's not going to 3-barrel with something like ace-6 in all likelihood, but he could potentially find 3 streets of value with a hand like ace-jack, or even maybe ace-10 if the board bricked off. Which puts me in a pretty dirty spot, whereas once you start check calling with some stronger hands and some draws thrown in there, it makes it a lot tougher for your opponent to go for 3 streets of thin value where your range is no longer face up as being kind of a weak bluff catcher. Bottom right, it's close between check raise, or it would be close versus a decent amount of people between check raising and check calling, but given his stack size, I don't think there's any need to really check raise, just because we're basically going to be able to get stacks in fairly easily if he just keeps betting, and my hand's not particularly vulnerable, and he can certainly value bet 3 streets with worse hands such as ace queen and ace king, as well as, you know, throwing some bluffs in there as well. Pocket jacks, I squeeze and get a caller. I think if I had the jack of diamonds, I would probably just check call here. Potentially bet, but I think given how vulnerable my hand is, I'm better off just betting and just hoping he kind of folds out some hands. And playing from there. Once he calls the flop, I'm probably just done, especially now that we've got a pot-sized bet left, basically. I think it's pretty ambitious to check call it off on the turn. Especially considering some of his flush draws are just going to fast play the flops, so that when I do bet hands like jacks, queens, and kings, that he potentially has some fold equity. Or even just when he has, queen, jack of diamonds or something, if I happen to have king, queen, he might want to just fold me off of those hands immediately. So even though I'm not saying he's going to fast play all of his flush draws, I definitely think some of them are going to fast play, whereas the vast majority of the ace-x, I think, just calls the flop, especially given that he's not going to have ace-king in his range very often once he calls and then just calls the squeeze. So he can't fast play as many of his ace-x just because those ace-x that do fast play and get action are probably going to be in pretty bad shape a lot of the time. So bottom left, we called one bet with the ace-2. It goes check-check on the turn. And now we have a decision between value betting or checking. I don't really think Villain's particularly likely to bluff after it went bet check, but it's also pretty hard for me to get value. So I think if I do value bet, I should probably be going on the smaller side here. So because I mean, if I bet something like 30 or 32 here, I just don't see him looking me up with worse pretty much ever, because he's got to basically put me on a hand like jacks or queens that's turning itself into a bluff on this river, trying to fold him off of king x. Also, I still think it's possible that he has a better ace than me, so I'd like to lose less when I do run into those hands. So I think a smaller value bet's probably in order here. But no, okay, I don't really like my play there. I end up kind of wussing out a little bit and just checking and hoping he doesn't. I mean, I'm going to have to call now, I think, once I take that line, but I think I'm better off making a small value bet myself. And hoping, because I mean, he's going to have king x a decent chunk of the time there once he chooses not to barrel the turn too. And king x is kind of in a weird spot where he's got a decision to make, so. Basically, I mean, those are the kind of spots, especially at smaller stakes as well, where when you have the opportunity to make a thin value bet, even if you think it's difficult to get called, a lot of the times you should probably be making it because you're going to see bluff raises less often. So you don't have to worry about what to do with those hands when you do get raised. And also, even if you think it's a really easy fold with certain parts of his range, not everyone plays really good poker, and you need to give weaker players an opportunity to make mistakes, really. Whereas at higher stakes, or in more aggressive games anyway, you have to be a little bit more careful when you make your hand range look fairly weak, because you can end up getting facing a lot more pressure in those spots, and you lose a lot of the value from making those thin value bets if your range is somewhat face up. So I put in one bet with the 9-10 on the flop there, and once he calls the flop, I think I'm pretty much done. I think he has a lot of ace-x in his range. He has some diamond draws, and then he's got some medium pairs as well, but I just have no equity when I barrel again, so I'd rather just give up. And as you can see there, he ended up having ace-king and put no more bets in, so he's the kind of guy that if he does bet a river, he's either going to be, well, he's basically just going to be really polarized. Whether or not he bluffs at all, I'm not sure, but he's certainly not going to have very many thin value bets after calling the flop and then checking back the turn on the river in that spot. So top left, we flop a gut shot, an overcard, and a backdoor flush draw, so I'm going to start by betting and just... There's going to be a lot of bets going in there in all likelihood, given the fact that I have a decent amount of equity and I can represent when the flush hits, knowing that he pretty much doesn't have very many flushes in his range, given that I have the blocker. It gives me some good hands to kind of throw into my bluff range there. Same thing in the top left. I'm going to be far more likely to make those kind of depolarized 3-bets versus opponents that at lower stakes and opponents who don't have full stacks, just because I'm not expecting to get messed with as much with 4-bet bluffs or like light 4-bets for value. So I'm just going to pause it for a second. Two spots here. Top right, I open ace-10 under the gun, I believe, or from under the gun +1. I get flatted by a shorter stack in the small blind. He leads into me. I could choose to raise here, but I don't really need to protect too much, I wouldn't think, especially given that I have the 10 of clubs. So I think I'm just going to let him put in some money drawing, like not particularly live most of the time. But given how small his bet is, I wouldn't hate raising either, just to charge him for when he's got draws worse, ace-x or queen-x. So I can kind of go either way on this. It's especially difficult to know what the best play is, as usual, with only one hand on someone. It's like if I'd seen him donking a whole bunch, so let's say we had like 50 hands on this guy, and he's been donking, 15, 20%, I'd be far more likely to raise here. Whereas if he hadn't donked yet, then I'd be far more likely to call, just because if he hasn't donked yet, and all of a sudden he comes out with his 50-cent bet here, and I raise it up, there's a very real possibility that I'm getting 3-bet here, and my hand still has outs or runner outs versus a lot of his value hands that are better than mine. So if he flatted a hand like ace-king or ace-jack, or if he flopped 2-pair, I've still got my backdoor clubs and my backdoor straight draws. So I'd rather not kind of get myself into a lot of trouble if he seems like he's got a tighter donking range. Bottom right, we end up having flopping a flush draw here, and Schmef raises on this board, which I think is going to be, I mean, at the time I thought it would be pretty polarized between kind of queen X and just some stuff monkeying around. So maybe like some backdoor diamond draws or something. I'm planning on calling the turn here, pretty much regardless of sizing, unless he overbets. My ace high is good sometimes, and then I have the flush draw to go with it, which is kind of my bailout cards a lot of the time, when he does end up having queen X. When he checks back the turn, after raising the flop, I think a lot of the time he was just messing around with, like something like king jack or something like that, and I've got showdown value a decent amount of the time. I don't think I need to turn this hand into a bluff, just because I do beat a bunch of those kind of junky hands, and I'm going to have enough flush draws that I would like to bluff with, so my, 8-9 of hearts, 7-8 of hearts, Jack-9 of hearts, stuff like that I'd rather bluff with, just because they don't beat anything at this point, and I can still credibly have queen X or aces or kings or something like that can value bet. So I choose to check here, but I think Schmef ends up surprising me and ended up raising a 5x or something like that hand, or pocket sevens. There you go. So he raises pocket sevens on the flop, so he's kind of just trying to raise for a showdown. That's going to make his life fairly difficult going forward if people see him doing that, just because you're going to be able to 3-bet flops, and then he's all of a sudden putting 3 bets in on the flop with a hand like pocket sevens, which is just guessing going forward and has no blockers to anything. So at the time I didn't really think he was going to be raising hands like that, but if I do, then all of a sudden 3-betting the flop becomes a lot more appealing with a hand like mine, or even just with some hands like backdoor diamonds or like Jack-10 of diamonds, something like that. Something that's going to have equity when it's called and can barrel a decent amount of turns. And yeah, basically just puts him in a tough spot with a hand like he's got. On the upside, I mean, his play is slightly better given that he's in position, whereas if he's out of position, his life's going to be hell because he's going to get floated more often, and people are going to be able to value bet rivers thinly and bluff a lot and stuff like that, whereas it's a little more difficult to make those kind of moves when you're out of position. Slightly loose peel here in the big blind, but it was a min raise and I had a suited ace, and it's 25-cent, 50 cents, so I'm kind of hoping I should have a post-flop edge here. So he bets the flop and then checks back the turn. This is the spot where, again, I think I probably have the best hand, but it's really hard to go get value from worse. But given the flush draw miss, I'm just going to make a small bet and hopefully he heroes. But people seem to basically just be folding rivers once they've checked back turns so far. Top left, I am thinking about what to do versus a half pot bet, and yeah, he shows up with, there were a bunch of draws that missed there, and so far people haven't shown an incredible ability to value bet thinly, and that's not something that really surprises me. Generally speaking, I think at the lower stakes you can assume that people aren't making thin value bets until proven otherwise, and that's definitely something I would take a note on when I do see it from villains, where if they do make a really thin value bet, that's something I want to know, because I'm going to assume for the most part that most players aren't making really thin river value bets. Even at like 2-4 and 3-6, you see a decent amount of people missing out on value bets that they should probably make. Bottom right, I ended up opting to slow play just because it's the kind of board where I'm going to have a lot of pairs that are going to have difficulty taking heat, so this is really good for my range to be able to call with a set here. I'm not particularly afraid of heart draws. I mean, if he hits a flush, then I've got to redraw, and he's also going to bluff that run out a decent amount, I would assume. So that kind of works for me as well. And then obviously the fact that that I have 2 of the 7s. This isn't going to be a huge factor given positions and this kind of board texture, but I block a little bit of his continuing range, whereas if I had 2s or 3s, it's a little bit more likely that he bet calls the flop with a hand like 7x. But again, that's not a major consideration, whereas if the board was, say, queen high, and it was like queen 9-3 rainbow, then that becomes a much bigger consideration, because when I raise, a lot more of his range is going to be queen x, so if I block 2 of the queens, then that's kind of a disaster. Whereas here, if I raised him and he continued, a lot of his range is going to be flush draws, but also a ton of his range is going to be overpairs, and obviously there's less overpairs on a queen high board than there is on a 7 high board. Bottom or top left back there, I just folded the gut shot. I think I could have led there, but certainly once I check, I'm not going to be check raising in a limped pot, just because people's ranges are kind of wide, and I think they get a little bit sticky in these limped pots. So don't want to go to war with the idiot end of a gut shot on a 2-tone board. Top right, I bet the flop with top pair, top kicker. He calls. I think his range can be fairly wide, and given that he doesn't have a full stack, I'm just going to go for a thin value bet on the turn. Or, I mean, it's not super thin, but, you know, it's not way up in my value range. And if he raises, I'm just going to fold, because my hand is in bad shape versus his value range, and I have no redraw, and my hand basically never improves when I'm behind. And if he calls, then I'll make a decision on rivers. I'll probably make a smallish bet on board pairs or other kind of blanks, and then just check down on kind of 4 straights or 4 flushes and stuff like that. Ace-5 on the bottom left, I like to check back. One thing I will say that I've also noticed about playing a mixture of stakes in this video is that a lot of times I think you're better off just putting out c-bets in spots that you might not at higher stakes, at the smaller stakes. So let me rephrase that. I think c-betting with your medium strength hands makes a lot more sense at smaller stakes, just because you're facing less check raises and less aggression in general. So you can get away with kind of betting more depolarized without having to worry about getting blown off your equity a lot of the time. And also, people are folding flops more often, unless you're talking about the recreational players. So you're not getting hurt basically for putting that bet out there as much as you would, again, in more aggressive games. And that's a similar concept to what I was talking about before with opening buttons wide, where people are more likely to be flatting from the blinds than they are to be 3-betting, so you get to realize your equity more often. Bottom right, I mean, everything goes crazy, and I was just bluffing with the ace-10, so got to get out of there. Jack-5 suited top right. I'm definitely going to c-bet with the backdoor flush draw and no showdown value really, or limited showdown value anyway. A couple of suited hands here. Ace-3 suited, I'm going to be opening under the gun pretty much always. I think I'm probably better off not opening ace-6 through ace-9. Doesn't seem to be a winning play for me anyway. But I'm going to be opening the other bigger suited aces, so, you know, ace-10 plus suited, which I'm sure almost everyone is. Ace-3 of hearts, I end up flatting here versus the leaf, whatever, whoever that is in the top right corner. I can't pronounce that name. I think if I was, I mean, again, I only have one hand on him, but he's got less than a full stack, and I think I might be better off just 3-betting here for value, knowing that I can take down the pot a decent amount, and I'm going to have a hand that can barrel a decent amount too. If I had a little bit of a bigger ace here, so maybe like ace-8 suited, then I think I almost always 3-bet for value here, just to isolate him and keep him away from the other regulars. But I don't think flatting is the end of the world either. It just sort of sucks if I'm at all concerned about getting squeezed by the other players, because obviously ace-3 is not a hand that can continue very well. Bottom right, I like to squeeze with queen-jack offsuit. I don't really want to flat going multi-way here, and it's an okay hand with blockers and stuff to squeeze, although it certainly could potentially get you in trouble if they flat a bunch of 3-bets, because you're going to be dominated a decent chunk of the time. He 4-bets me though, and don't have to worry about that. So as I was saying before, I think I'm better off just betting a lot of my medium strength hands. So I think ace-8 on the top left in the 10-25 cent game is better off just betting the flop. And then if I get check raised, I can pretty much know that I'm up against a pretty strong range most of the time. Instead, I'm just kind of giving free cards to hands that have equity a lot of the time. So, especially with those more vulnerable pairs anyway. So like ace-8's a lot more vulnerable there than say jack-10 would be on queen-jack X, for instance. So that's something I would definitely try and correct if I was to be playing this session over again, is basically just put out a lot more of those bets with vulnerable hands, especially at the in these smaller games. Bottom right, I get jammed on, and again, I mean, that's potentially a call if I had seen that player a little bit more, just because some people are just kind of crazy at Zoom and just shoveling it in after they've lost a pot and stuff like that. But no stats on him, so just going to let it go. Ace-10 isn't doing great versus a particularly reasonable range. Top right, I'm planning on just basically putting one bet out there unless I hit a king-10 or queen or jack or potentially even an ace. Basically, unless I pick up equity, I'm done here. It's a board where I should expect to get a decent amount of folds. I pick up a gut shot on the turn, and it's an overcard, so I'm just going to bet again and then make a decision on the river on whether or not to triple barrel, basically. I think it's probably a decent spot to triple barrel if a blank comes off, just because I would expect most of his sets and his flushes to fast play the flop. So by the time he gets to the turn, his range is pretty weak with just kind of like a pair and a flush draw a lot of the time. Unless he ends up hitting something like queen-9, which, I mean, isn't a particularly big part of his range, obviously. Bottom left, like I said, that's a much better example of a check back, I think, than checking back the ace-8 before, just because I don't have anywhere near as much to worry about. On the turn, I definitely think I should be betting the turn there with jack-6. He can call with a whole bunch of pairs that are worse than mine, and if he does call, I don't have to necessarily put in a bet on the river. I can certainly check back, and if I do end up hitting a jack or a 6 on the river, I give myself the option to build a bigger pot. So if I'm not concerned about him check raising turns a whole bunch, I definitely think the better play here would be to just bet the turn with the jack-6. Also, it's pretty tough to sell a bluff a lot of the time when you go check and then bet the river, because most of the hands that you would need to bluff with probably would have bluffed at an earlier point. So it's going to look like you rivered something, or that you've just been kind of not slow playing, but pot controlling with a medium strength hand once you take that line a lot of the time. And obviously that that changes if you're playing against very good or very spewy players. But against the average regular, I think it's safe to say that's a pretty value heavy line a lot of the time. And that's one of those lines where it's almost like a bell curve in a way, where you're pretty likely to see those bets for the most part be value, but then on either side, where you're either playing a really good player or a really overly aggressive bad player, use those lines as bluffs, and it's kind of a fine line between those two sometimes on plays like that. Top right, pocket nines. I think this should be a call, given that I'm in position and my hand flops okay, and I'm getting an okay price. On this flop, he checks to me, and given that I don't have any read on him and we're at 25 cent, 50 cent, I think I'm just going to throw a half pot bet out there and try and protect my hand. If he check raises, he just wins the pot. I'm not going to mess with him, but it's really hard to think of too many hands that he can check raise bluff with, because even when he's check raise semi-bluffing, I think he's got something like ace queen of clubs most often, and I really just I think a big chunk of the time as well when he checks, he's basically just check folding. So I think the best play there versus kind of somewhat predictable opponents, or people you perceive to be predictable anyway, is just put a bet out there and hope to take it down. Your hand's just so vulnerable to overcards as well that it's going to make bluff catching a pain in the ass, and it's going to look like you capped your range a lot as well. So versus more aggressive players, once you check back there, they're going to look to fire a few barrels. So it's definitely not the worst thing in the world to check back something like top set there. Then again, I mean, poker's pretty easy if you just had top set and overpairs all the time. Obviously, it's not quite that easy. Bottom left, I just elect to check call the flop with ace jack with the ace of hearts. I'm going to be able to call a decent amount of turns because I have the ace of hearts in my hand, and also my hand's best some of the time, or a decent chunk of the time anyway, blind versus blind. And he's fairly likely to barrel ace x when I hit it too, just because I can be check calling stuff like 6x or pocket sevens. If we do get in a spot where the board runs out ugly and he's shown some weakness, then I can always turn my hand into a bluff. But as played, he ends up checking the turn, so I just go for value on the river. I almost always have the best hand once it plays out like this, unless he rivered a set of threes, or a boat, sorry, and he didn't, so that worked out well. 3-bet the pocket kings in the bottom right. Not going to be slow playing there a whole bunch, especially from the small blind, but I mean, if you know, the big blind was super squeeze happy or something like that, then it's a possibility. And on that flop, I think it's just kind of a standard c-bet. I'm going to want to bet tons of my air, and villain should have to float a decent amount there to stop me from betting any two. And obviously he's going to have a bunch of pocket pairs in his range too, so I think that all plays out pretty well. Squeeze with the pocket, with ace king suited in the bottom left. I'm going to be stacking off versus pretty much everyone unless it goes crazy. So like, let's say I get squeezed here and then one of these other guys goes all in. I think I should be finding a fold. The cold 4-bet doesn't scare me that much. I mean, the added bonus is that I'm suited too, so get a little bit of extra equity when I run into like kings or aces. But so yeah, once it gets back raised here, I think Karma Police just has to have a really strong hand. At this point, I'm thinking probably kings plus. It's possible he's just getting it in too light, but I already wasn't feeling incredibly comfortable going up against the big blind to begin with, so I find a fold here, I think, and I think I'm going to let us see the results, hopefully. Yeah. One of my favorite things in Zoom is when you get into a spot like this, when you actually get to see people show down. So they end up having queens and aces, so it ended up being a good laydown. Like I said, I mean, I'm perfectly happy to stack off to one person there, but once a bunch of people show that they want to put a bunch of money in, and someone opened it from early position, you squeeze, it got cold 4-bet. I mean, there's only so many raises that can go in before you realize that you're pretty cooked versus someone's range anyway. Pocket 5s in the bottom right. I probably wouldn't be flatting if it was just a heads up pot, but given that we're going multi-way, I think it's going to be fine. If he was 100 big blinds and it was a heads up pot, I'd probably 3-bet more often than just call, just because the hand isn't going to play great out of position. But if you're a superstar post flop and you're really good at bluff raising with those kind of hands, then maybe you can get away with it. I personally don't think that's the strongest part of my game, so I try to stay out of those spots as much as possible. I get led into here with ace-2 on a really coordinated board, and that's... I have a backdoor flush draw and an overcard, but the board's so coordinated that even when he's messing around a little bit, he's going to have a bunch of opportunities to take the pot off of me, and I'm not going to be able to call on too many turns and rivers, so I just let him have it. And even if he's donking a whole bunch, I'm just going to have much better hands to go to war with him than that. Ace-4 suited in the bottom right is definitely a hand I could 3-bet bluff with, but looks like I've got some other hands that have caught my eye. King-9 suited, I am c-betting because I have an overcard, a backdoor straight draw, and a backdoor flush draw. Also, the small blind's going to have a really wide range here a lot of the time, I think, because he just called after he knew it was going multi-way, and because he's got a half stack. So yes, he's more likely to be kind of stationary, but he's also pretty likely to have a wide range here. And me betting into two people instead of betting into just one person is going to make it look stronger to Henkus, I would assume. So I should have some opportunities to barrel or just have immediate fold equity on the flop anyway. So he thinks for a while. We get one fold and two folds. There you go, perfect. I mean, that backdoor equity is going to be so important in those spots too, because even if I expect it to look fairly strong, I want to have some options on turns. I don't want to just be basically playing with two Uno cards, and just hoping that they're folding, because that takes a lot of value away from the bet to begin with if I just don't have any chance of being able to barrel turns or picking up equity. It's always nice to be able to suck out versus the nutted parts of people's range too. So backdoor equity is always something to consider when looking at c-betting flops, especially with your bluff range. So that being said, hopefully I check with the queen jack of hearts there, yeah. So all I've got there is a backdoor straight draw, and not even all those outs are going to be good. So I basically just get out of the way there. So jack 6 here, I end up putting in a raise on the flop. I don't really think that's necessary. I guess it's a really small pot, and I'm just hoping that Barba 4444 isn't able to lay down a queen on either the flop or the turn, and then potentially even the river. So I put in a raise. I get 3-bet by the guy who limped, and that looks really, really strong to me, so I'm not feeling particularly good about my hand. But I still have trips, and thankfully he looks like he's probably a weaker player seeing as he limped, and because he basically min 3-bet this dry flop. So I'm going to call and probably go to showdown, but not be feeling great about it. And obviously it's going to depend on the board run out too. If a queen hits, I'm obviously going to find a fold. Or not obviously, but I mean, I am going to find a fold. So I check to him, and if he bets again, I'm definitely calling. I'm hoping here that he doesn't end up, betting close to $6. Once he bets 250, I feel a ton better about my hand now. I think he's far more likely to be kind of polarized at this point between, say, a hand like a boat or just kind of some kind of garbage. And we get a 6 on the river, and this is potentially a mistake on my part. I'm not really sure if I'm just being results oriented here, but at the smaller stakes, I don't think I should be expecting people to make thin value bets. And given how the hand's played out, I'm really likely to have a queen or a 6 here. And if he was monkeying around with something that picked up showdown value, so like ace-5 or something like that, I think there's an outside chance that he calls a small bet with a 5, but almost no chance that he bluffs with it. And when he does have a queen, I would expect him to bet most of the time, but it's possible that he just doesn't bet, given that he's shown only to be passive so far pre-flop with his limp and the fact that he hasn't played any hands so far apart from that hand. So I might be better off, well, it's close, between betting myself for like say $8 or $9 or going for the check raise. If I go for the check raise, I don't really see him bet folding a queen, and there is a possibility that he has aces or kings here, which definitely won't be bet folding. But the problem is when he does check back a queen, it's kind of a disaster here, because there's absolutely zero chance that he ever folds a queen to a bet. So it kind of depends on my estimation of where his range is at in this situation. And yeah, spoiler alert, I think he ended up having a queen that he checked back. Yeah, queen jack. So that's sort of a mini disaster in terms of EV there. But I just didn't really think it was likely at all that he would check back a queen, given that it's a boat. But I mean, it's not necessarily a bad play from him once he's kind of narrowed my range down as much as he has by me raising the flop and then calling a 3-bet and then calling the turn. I'm gonna have a queen or trips there always pretty much, and I'm not sure if he figured that out or if he's just not capable of making thin value bets. But either way, I mean, I can't hate on him too much for checking back there, just because he's not going to get called by worse pretty much ever. So maybe it just is better, especially against weaker opponents, to just put a bet out there myself. I think that could be true even in bigger games too, just where if they can hand read, they shouldn't be making a thin value bet there. But most people probably don't have the discipline to lay down a hand like Queen X just because of all the times that they're chopping as well. So I mean, it's not necessarily a discipline problem. I mean, it's just there's a lot more combos of Queen X than there are of quads, basically. So same spot as earlier with the Queen 10 here, where I'm just going to bet for weird. Okay, so I think I should be betting for value on the turn, and if he raises, then so be it. I'm not really sure why I checked back there, especially without having a club in my hand. It doesn't really make too much sense. Yeah, and I end up getting sucked out on, so I get what I deserve there. For the most part, I mean, you should just be betting turns with medium strength hands and not worry about being check raised until it actually happens. And in a situation like that as well, like getting check raised really isn't the end of the world because my hand wasn't particularly good to start off with. I mean, it's just top pair on a 3 flush board, and I have no redraw, so it's not like I'm costing myself a ton of money where I could have checked back and realized my equity. I mean, when I get check raised there, I'm basically drawing dead anyway because it's mostly just flushes and sets, and I mean a lot more flushes than sets. And against those hands, I just have no equity with a bare top pair anyway, so it's really not that big a deal. So, moral of the story, bet the turn. Bottom right, I got donked into twice with Queen Jack, and once I hit 2 pair, I'm just not folding. It's definitely possible that he has some bluffs, although not particularly likely, but he can also just be value betting worse hands. And he was, leading with Ace X, no kicker on the flop, and then picked up a diamond draw on the turn, and then river to flush. But so be it. I mean, that's a situation where I'm not going to be folding. Basically, I mean, you have 2 pair in a late position situation where both ranges are kind of wide, and you're just not going to be able to have better than 2 pair all that often. I think bottom or top right there, I should probably open the 9-4 suited, given that the villain seems like he's been playing pretty tightly so far. So this is kind of refreshing. I've definitely found a few mistakes in here. This review's a little bit later than the last one I did too, so the hands were a lot fresher in my memory, and I was probably really on board with the plays a lot more so when I reviewed the first part than this part, where I'm not really sure what I'm going to be doing every time. And hopefully, yeah, okay, good. I thought I was going to fold the king queen in the top left, but that's definitely a spot where I want to make a small ISO, and hopefully he comes along with a wide range. I could potentially even go smaller, just given that his stack's so small, but that's fine. So, bottom left, Ace-King is a hand that I'm normally just 4-bet getting in there, but given that we're about 150 big blinds deep and I don't really have any hands on him, I would expect that his 3-betting range is going to be tighter. And if not tighter, certainly more polarized. So I don't think I do so great when I 4-bet unless I expect him to be flatting a bunch of 4-bets. So I like to go the slightly lower variance, more conservative route here and just flat the 3-bet, and I've got position, so I mean, it's not the end of the world for sure. I'd prefer to be suited in this spot, but I definitely don't feel good about 4-bet getting in for 150 big blinds, small blind versus cutoff versus an unknown at 50 cents a dollar. So, yeah, that's basically the rationale behind that play. Top left, I'm probably just going to bet once and hope to take it down. There's no merit to checking back, really, unless I just think I have 0 fold equity on the flop. I can pretty much never win a showdown. He's going to bluff a lot. I don't pick up any equity ever, so, yeah. Bottom left, I'm probably going to be going call, 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 given that my hand's pretty high up in my range. I mean, the only hands that I'm going to have that are better at this point are 7s, 3s, and 10s. Maybe the occasional king 10 suited, but yeah, I'm definitely calling to the $20 bet. I'm then hoping that he doesn't really jam the river, but I mean, if he does, like I said, I'm gonna probably bet it myself. So yeah, he checks to me, and I'm feeling pretty good about my hand now. I think if he had a stronger hand than me, he's almost definitely going for 3 streets. So I also think it's going to be kind of hard for him to call with worse hands, so I think it's important that I use smaller sizing here. Hoping to get a crying call from, king, queen, king, jack, or pocket queens. So I think a half pot bet's in order here. If he does check jam on me, I think it's a relatively easy fold versus an unknown, even though we're getting a great price, just because I don't think we're ever seeing a hand that's not better than mine, basically. Especially given that he's going to be I'm going to be getting a min raise to call his river all in, basically. So most people don't really want to bluff too much in a spot where they're giving you a great price. Top left, like I said, once he calls the flop, I'm just done. I pick up equity with a gut shot, but the problem is that way too often he's got a hand like ace-x or a pair with a diamond, and I don't expect any of those to fold on the turn. So I kind of have to commit to a 3-barrel if I'm going to do that, and stack sizes just don't really work for that. I'd have to bet something like 2 and then 8 on the river, which is just, I mean, I expect to get jammed on a ton if I bet 2 on the turn. So I end up betting, I think, $50 here on the bottom left. And so hard for me not to say the results before it happens. He calls with aces, which, I don't know, he should probably just value bet himself, because I'm not going to have a ton of floats, and I don't think he should necessarily expect me to value bet really thinly there. But you know, he wins the pot. Congratulations. I think he loses out on a decent amount of value when I just have king x there too, because I'm not value betting all of my king x there probably. Although, I mean, given that he's an unknown, maybe I do. Not all of them, but king queen's going to be pretty close, I think. But when I have queens and jacks and stuff and can potentially make a really bad call, he loses out on those where I'm certainly checking back. Ace jack, I'm just going to peel once here, given that I've got second pair top kicker with a backdoor flush draw, backdoor straight draw. If he puts any more money in, I should probably just fold. It's kind of tempting to call because I picked up the gut shot, but it's really unlikely that he's kind of pure bluffing here, and most of his hands are going to have me beat or have very, very good equity versus me. So I think folding's fine. Pocket twos is just a multi-way spot again, so definitely going to see a flop. Basically getting out of the way unless I flop a 2 or something like 3, 4, 5 or something like that where I could potentially semi-bluff, but definitely not on that flop. Top right, I don't think I have quite enough equity to be betting here, because even the cards that improve my equity for barreling, such as like a queen or a 10, are cards that should hit him pretty hard once he calls the flop, so I don't want to commit myself to betting a whole bunch of barrels on cards that improve my equity but also improve his range a ton. So I just elect to check back here, and I'll potentially make a delayed c-bet if he checks to me again. He bets, and I've got an open-ended straight draw, and he bets under half pot, so I'm probably going to peel here, I would assume, and then potentially bluff some rivers if he checks to me, because I can still have a bunch of weaker ace-x in my range, and maybe even a hand like king-jack that could value bet, but he bets again, and I'm just, I'm done. I'm not going to check back and then call and then put in a raise representing nothing versus some guy who hasn't even played with me before, because it's not a particularly credible line, I don't think. So this is pretty much the end of the footage. As usual, let me know if you've got any comments or questions in the video comments section, and I'll get back to you guys as soon as possible. And if you have any ideas for any videos that you want to see or anything like that, be sure to mention them in the suggestions. There's no suggestions box, but what I meant to say was in the comments section, and I'll certainly bear those in mind when putting together my next few videos. So this has been James Hudson or Iron Lucky for RunItOnce.com. Thanks. Bye.